discovered a bear cub locked in a candy store display case. What he did next was sweet. The old grandfather clock in the corner of Marshall's sweet shop struck 11, its deep chime echoing through the empty store like a gentle reminder that the day had finally come to rest. Ethan Marshall wiped down the last of the glass counters, the soft cloth squeaking against the pristine surface as he moved in slow, methodical circles. The shop had been in his family for 3 generations, and every night he performed this same ritual, this same careful cleaning that his father had done before him, and his grandfather before that. The amber glow from the vintage street lamps outside filtered through the large front windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor tiles that had been worn smooth by decades of eager customers. His 18-month-old son Leo sat in his high chair behind the counter, fighting sleep with the determination only a toddler could muster, his tiny fists rubbing at eyes that kept drooping closed before snapping open again. The baby babbled softly to himself, a gentle stream of nonsense words that filled the quiet shop with a kind of music that made Ethan smile despite his exhaustion. Something caught Ethan's eye as he moved toward the main display case, the one his grandfather had installed back in 1952, the one with the ornate brass corners and the thick glass that had somehow never cracked or chipped despite all the years of use. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the light from the street outside, but as he drew closer, his cloth stopped moving, his hand frozen in mid-wipe. There, curled up on the burgundy velvet lining of the display case, nestled between towers of rainbow lollipops and pyramids of chocolate truffles, was a small bear cub, not a teddy bear, not a chocolate sculpture, but an actual, breathing bear cub, its tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur a rich brown that seemed to shimmer in the soft lighting, with a cream-colored patch on its chest that looked almost like a heart. Ethan blinked hard, then blinked again, certain that the long day had finally caught up with him and his tired eyes were playing tricks, but the cub remained, real as the glass case that held it, real as the sudden quickening of his own heartbeat. Leo had noticed it too, his sleepy complaints suddenly transforming into excited squeals as he pointed his chubby finger at the display case, bouncing in his high chair with such enthusiasm that it creaked against the old wooden floor. "Bay, Bay," the baby called out, his version of bear that he'd learned from his favorite picture book, the one Lily read to him every night before bed. The cub stirred slightly at the sound, one tiny ear twitching, but it didn't wake, just shifted position and curled tighter into itself, its small paws tucked under its chin in a pose so endearing that Ethan felt his initial shock melting into something softer, something closer to wonder. He moved closer to the case, his reflection ghosting across the glass as he examined every detail, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The case was locked. He could see the brass padlock hanging exactly where he'd left it when he'd restocked the display that afternoon. And more puzzling still, there was no sign of how the cub could have gotten inside. No broken glass, no lifted lid, no disturbed candy, nothing except this impossible, sleeping visitor. The rational part of Ethan's mind, the part that balanced books and managed inventory and dealt with suppliers, was screaming that this made no sense. That bears didn't just appear in locked display cases in candy shops in the middle of suburban neighborhoods, but another part of him, a quieter part that remembered being a child in this very shop, pressing his nose against this same glass case while his grandfather told him stories about magic and wonder. That part whispered that maybe, just maybe, some things didn't need to make sense to be real. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen as he debated who to call. Animal control seemed like the logical choice, but something stopped him. some instinct that told him this wasn't a situation for authorities and protocols. Instead, he found himself calling Lily, his wife, who was visiting her sister across town for the evening. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, before her warm voice filled his ear, asking if everything was okay, if Leo was being fussy about bedtime again. "Lily," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had brought this creature here. "You need to come to the shop, right now. And before you ask, yes, Leo is fine, we're both fine, but there's something here you need to see." He could hear the concern in her voice as she asked what was wrong, what had happened, but he couldn't find the words to explain, couldn't figure out how to tell her that there was a bear cub sleeping in their candy display without sounding completely insane. "Just trust me," he said finally, "and maybe bring your camera. No one is going to believe this without proof." As he ended the call, Leo had managed to wiggle down from his high chair, something Ethan hadn't even known the baby could do yet, and was now pressed against the display case, his small hands leaving prints on the glass as he cooed softly at the sleeping cub. The baby's gentleness surprised Ethan, the way Leo seemed to understand instinctively that this was a moment for quiet wonder, not loud excitement. The cub opened its eyes then, 2 dark pools that reflected the shop's warm lighting like polished stones, and for a moment all 3 of them were perfectly still, caught in a triangle of mutual curiosity. The cub didn't seem frightened or aggressive, just calmly interested, its head tilting slightly as it observed the baby on the other side of the glass. Leo giggled, a soft, delighted sound, and pressed his nose against the case, fogging it up with his breath. The cub responded by placing one small paw against the glass from the inside, right where Leo's hand rested, and Ethan felt his throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was such a pure moment, such an innocent connection between 2 young creatures who didn't know they were supposed to be afraid of each other, who only knew curiosity and wonder. Ethan found himself thinking about all the people watching this story unfold, perhaps from their own homes late at night, perhaps finding comfort in this strange, gentle mystery. He wondered where they were watching from, what brought them to this moment, this story of impossible things happening in the most ordinary of places. Maybe they too were looking for something magical in their everyday lives, something to remind them that the world still held surprises, still held moments of pure, inexplicable beauty. 20 minutes passed like this, the 3 of them existing in a bubble of quiet amazement, before Ethan heard Lily's key in the front door. She rushed in, her hair slightly disheveled from the quick drive, her eyes immediately scanning the shop for signs of trouble. When Ethan pointed to the display case, she stopped mid-step, her mouth falling open in a perfect O of surprise. "How?" was all she managed to say, moving closer with the same careful steps one might use approaching a butterfly, afraid that any sudden movement might make it disappear. The cub watched her approach with the same calm interest it had shown Ethan and Leo, and Lily's hand went to her heart, a gesture Ethan recognized from 20 years of marriage as her response to being deeply moved. She knelt down next to Leo, who immediately climbed into her lap, pointing excitedly at his new friend while babbling his baby words with increased enthusiasm. "Ethan," Lily said slowly, her eyes never leaving the cub, "this display case. Your grandfather used to tell stories about it. I thought they were just stories, just his way of making the shop seem more magical for the children, but he always said this case was special, that it was a doorway of sorts." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, remembering now those same stories, dismissed as the fantasies of an old man who'd spent too many years surrounded by sugar and children's laughter. His grandfather had claimed that sometimes, on very special nights, When the world needed a reminder of gentleness and wonder, the case would host unusual visitors. Ethan had loved those stories as a child, but had filed them away with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy as he grew older, beautiful lies told to make childhood more magical. Yet here was proof that maybe, just maybe, his grandfather hadn't been telling stories at all. The cub yawned then, a surprisingly large yawn that showed rows of tiny teeth and a pink tongue, before settling back down into its curled position. Leo yawned in response, the contagious nature of yawns apparently crossing species barriers, and Lily smiled despite the surreal nature of the situation. "We should call someone," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to, that she wanted to preserve this moment just as it was, untouched by the outside world's need for explanations and interventions. Ethan nodded, but made no move toward his phone. And they sat there together, a family of 3, watching over an impossible visitor, guardians of a secret that felt too precious to share with anyone who might not understand. The shop felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made the familiar space seem new and full of possibility. As if sensing their dilemma, the cub shifted position, and Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was a small brass plate on the inside of the case, one he'd polished 1,000 times from the outside, but had never really read. Now, illuminated by the angle of the cub's movement, he could make out words etched in an old-fashioned script. For those who still believe in gentle magic, this case serves as a reminder that wonder never truly leaves us. It only waits for the right moment to return. The words were signed with his grandfather's initials and dated just a month before he'd passed away. As if he'd known someone would need to read them someday, would need this confirmation that magic wasn't just for children's stories. Lily saw it too, her sharp intake of breath telling Ethan she understood the significance. This wasn't random, wasn't some freak occurrence. This was something his grandfather had somehow known about, had perhaps even experienced himself on some long-ago night when he'd been the one closing up shop, wiping down counters, tending to the everyday magic of bringing sweetness into people's lives. "We're supposed to watch," Lily whispered, understanding flooding her features. "We're not supposed to interfere or call for help. We're supposed to witness." And somehow, that felt right to Ethan, felt like the correct response to finding a bear cub in a locked display case. They were meant to be guardians of this moment, keepers of this gentle mystery that asked nothing of them but their presence and their wonder. Leo had fallen asleep in Lily's arms, his head heavy against her shoulder, but even in sleep one of his hands remained pressed against the glass, maintaining that connection with the sleeping cub. The shop's old radiator kicked on with a gentle hum, filling the space with warmth, and Ethan found himself thinking about all the nights his grandfather must have spent here after closing, all the secrets this old building held in its walls and floors and cases. He thought about sharing this moment with everyone watching, about how sometimes the most extraordinary things happened in the most ordinary places, how a simple candy shop could become a place of magic just by being open to the possibility. He wanted to tell them to look for these moments in their own lives, to pay attention to the small mysteries that might be waiting in their own familiar spaces. Whether they were watching from busy cities or quiet towns, from places where bears were common or places where they existed only in storybooks, this moment belonged to all of them equally. This shared wonder, this collective holding of breath as they waited to see what would happen next, it connected them across distances and differences, made them all guardians of this gentle secret together. The cub stirred again, this time opening its eyes fully and sitting up. It looked around the case with what seemed like satisfaction. as if it had accomplished whatever it had come here to do. Then it did something that made both Ethan and Lily gasp. It stood on its hind legs and placed both paws against the glass, right where Leo's hand rested, and for just a moment Ethan could have sworn he saw a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from a summer pavement, but inside the case. The brass lock on the case clicked open by itself, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet shop, and the lid of the case rose slowly, smoothly, as if lifted by invisible hands. The cub climbed out with careful movements, its claws clicking softly on the glass shelves as it navigated around the candy displays without disturbing a single piece. It dropped to the floor with a soft thump and padded over to where they sat, frozen in amazement. Leo woke at the sound, his eyes widening with delight rather than fear as the cub approached. The baby reached out with grabbing hands, and the cub moved just close enough for Leo to touch its fur. Just once, his tiny fingers sinking into the soft brown coat before the cub stepped back. It was such a gentle exchange, such a careful acknowledgement of each other, that Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something orchestrated by forces beyond their understanding. Something meant to remind them that the world was far more mysterious and wonderful than their daily routines might suggest. The cub walked toward the front door then, and without thinking, Ethan stood and opened it, as if he'd done this 100 times before, as if letting magical bear cubs out of candy shops was just part of closing up for the night. The cub paused at the threshold, turned back to look at them one more time, and then disappeared into the night with a silence that seemed impossible for any living creature. The door swung closed on its own, the bell above it chiming once, sweetly, before falling silent. They sat there in the aftermath, the shop feeling both empty and full, ordinary and extraordinary, the same and forever changed. The display case lid was still open, the brass lock hanging loose, the only physical evidence that what they'd witnessed had been real. Lily was the first to speak, her voice soft and wondering. Your grandfather knew. He knew this would happen someday, knew we'd be here to see it. She stood carefully, still holding Leo, and walked to the display case. There, on the burgundy velvet where the cub had been sleeping, was a single perfect autumn leaf, golden brown and somehow fresh despite it being the middle of summer. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her fingers, and Ethan saw that there were words written on it in what looked like gold ink, though how that was possible he couldn't begin to guess. The words were simple. Thank you for keeping the door open. They looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. This was why the shop had survived 3 generations, why it had weathered economic downturns and changing neighborhoods and the rise of big box stores. It wasn't just a candy shop. It was a place where magic could rest when it needed to, where wonder could take shelter in a world that sometimes forgot to believe in it. Leo reached for the leaf, and Lily let him hold it, watched as he examined it with the serious concentration of a baby discovering something new. He babbled at it, a long string of syllables that almost sounded like words, like he was having a conversation with the leaf that made perfect sense in whatever language babies spoke before they learned ours. The leaf seemed to glow faintly in his hands, or maybe that was just the way the shop lights caught its surface, but either way, it was beautiful. Ethan thought about all the nights he'd closed up shop feeling tired and ordinary, thinking about profit margins and inventory, never knowing that he was the keeper of something far more precious than candy. He thought about his grandfather, working these same late hours, perhaps hoping that one day his grandson would understand that some family businesses were about more than just making a living. Should we tell anyone? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. This wasn't the kind of story you told at dinner parties or posted on social media. This was the kind of story you held close, that you remembered on difficult days when the world seemed too harsh and predictable. This was the kind of story that changed you not by its telling, but by its keeping, by the way it settled into your bones and reminded you that mystery and wonder were not just for children, but for anyone brave enough to stay open to them. Lily shook her head, confirming what he already knew. They would keep this secret, would tend it, like gardeners tend a rare and delicate plant. Would make sure the shop remained a place where such things could happen. They stayed in the shop for another hour, cleaning up though there was nothing to clean, reorganizing displays that didn't need reorganizing, just reluctant to leave the space where magic had so recently visited. Leo fell asleep again, the leaf still clutched in his tiny fist, and they finally decided it was time to go home. As Ethan turned off the lights and locked the door, he looked back at the display case one more time. It looked exactly as it always had, gave no sign of what it had contained just an hour before. But he knew now that it was more than just glass and brass and velvet. It was a threshold, a place where the ordinary and extraordinary could meet and recognize each other. He made a mental note to polish it extra carefully from now on, to keep it ready for whatever might need shelter next. The drive home was quiet, Leo sleeping in his car seat, the leaf still in his hand, Lily staring out the window at the familiar streets that somehow looked different now, touched by the possibility of magic. Ethan thought about everyone who had shared this story with them, wondered if they too were looking at their own familiar world with new eyes, searching for the places where wonder might be hiding in plain sight. He hoped they were, hoped this story would remind them that mystery wasn't something that only existed in far-off places or ancient times, but was alive and present in the here and now, waiting for those who knew how to see it. The night air was cool through the cracked window, carrying the scent of summer flowers and the distant sound of wind chimes, and everything felt connected somehow, all part of the same great mystery that had brought a bear cub to their candy shop. When they got home, they put Leo to bed still holding the leaf, and he smiled in his sleep, as if dreaming of his new friend. Ethan and Lily sat up for a while longer, not talking much, just being together in the quiet understanding of what they'd witnessed. They didn't need words to process it. Some experiences were beyond language, could only be held in the heart and remembered in the body. The grandfather clock in their hallway, a twin to the one in the shop, chimed midnight, and they finally went to bed, carrying the magic of the evening with them into their dreams. The world outside continued its spinning. Cars passed on distant highways. People lived their lives unaware that in a small candy shop, the impossible had just happened. But for those who had witnessed it, either in person or through this story, the world would never be quite the same again. The next morning brought sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and Leo's happy babbling from his crib. Everything seemed normal. Seemed like perhaps the previous night had been a shared dream, until Lily went to get Leo and found the leaf still in his hand, still perfect and golden and impossible. She brought him to their bed, and the three of them lay there looking at the leaf, remembering. Ethan thought about opening the shop that morning, about whether the display case would look different in the daylight, whether customers would sense something had changed. He decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that they knew, that they had been chosen to witness something extraordinary, to be part of a story that connected past and present and future in ways they were only beginning to understand. Lily suggested they frame the leaf, put it somewhere in the shop where they could see it but others wouldn't notice, a secret reminder of what was possible. Ethan liked that idea, liked the thought of having a talisman of sorts, something to look at on difficult days when the world seemed too mundane and predictable. They got ready for the day slowly, savoring the sense of being part of something larger than themselves, something that included bear cubs and magical display cases and grandfather's stories that turned out to be true. Leo seemed different too, calmer somehow, as if the encounter had given him something he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. He kept making the sign for bear and then the sign for friend, a combination that made Lily's eyes well up with tears every time. When they arrived at the shop, there was already a small line of customers waiting, regulars who came for their morning coffee and pastries. Everything looked exactly as it always did, the display case showing no sign of its nighttime visitor except for a very faint impression in the velvet lining, so slight that only someone who knew to look for it would notice. Ethan opened the door and welcomed everyone in, and the day began like any other, filled with the familiar rhythms of commerce and community. But underneath the ordinary surface, Ethan felt the hum of magic, the knowledge that this place was special in ways his customers couldn't imagine. He watched them browse the candy displays, saw children press their noses against the glass case just as he had done decades ago, and wondered which of them might one day be the keeper of this secret, the next guardian of this gentle mystery. Around midday, something interesting happened. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with dark curls and serious eyes, stood in front of the display case for a long time, so long that her mother had to call her twice to come pay for their purchases. As she finally turned to leave, she looked up at Ethan and said, very quietly, "The bear was beautiful, wasn't it?" Before he could respond, before he could even process what she'd said, she was gone, following her mother out the door with a secret smile. Ethan stood frozen, wondering how she could have known, whether she'd somehow seen what they'd seen, whether the magic of the place had shown her something too. He decided not to overthink it, to accept it as part of the mystery, part of the ongoing story that his grandfather had started and that would continue long after he was gone. The afternoon brought its usual rush of after-school customers, kids with crumpled dollar bills choosing between gummy bears and chocolate bars, parents sneaking treats for themselves while pretending they were only there for their children. Through it all, Ethan found himself glancing at the display case, half expecting to see another impossible visitor, but it remained filled only with candy. Lily stopped by with Leo around 3, and the baby immediately went to the case, patting it gently and babbling his bear friend combination of words. A few customers smiled at his enthusiasm, probably thinking he was just excited about the candy, not knowing he was greeting the memory of something far more extraordinary. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself thinking about the nature of magic, how it wasn't always grand and dramatic, but sometimes quiet and gentle, like a bear cub sleeping among candy, like a leaf that shouldn't exist, but did. He thought about how many small miracles might be happening all around them all the time, unnoticed because people were too busy or too skeptical to see them. He made a promise to himself to pay more attention, to look for the subtle signs of wonder that might be hiding in plain sight. The shop felt different to him now, not just a business, but a responsibility, a trust passed down through generations to keep a space where magic could feel welcome. That evening, as closing time approached, Ethan found himself moving more slowly, wondering if perhaps the cub would return, if this was going to be a regular occurrence. But the shop remained quiet, ordinary, just a candy store at the end of another business day. He realized he wasn't disappointed. What had happened the night before felt complete somehow, like a story that had been told exactly as it needed to be told. He locked the display case carefully, gave it an extra polish, and whispered a quiet thank you to it, to his grandfather, to whatever forces had orchestrated the previous night's visit. The brass plate with his grandfather's message caught the light, and he read it again, understanding now that it wasn't just about the case, but about maintaining a certain kind of openness to the world, a willingness to believe in gentle magic. As he turned off the lights and prepared to leave, he thought one more time about everyone who had shared this journey with them, all the people watching from their own corners of the world, each bringing their own hopes and dreams and need for wonder to this story. He hoped they would carry a piece of it with them, would remember that magic didn't always announce itself with fanfare and fireworks, but sometimes came quietly, gently, like a cub seeking shelter in a candy store. He hoped they would look at their own familiar spaces with new eyes, would stay open to the possibility that wonder might be waiting for them in the most unexpected places. The shop door closed behind him with its familiar chime, and he stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking back at the window display, at the ordinary storefront that held such extraordinary secrets. The walk to his car was short, but he took his time, noticing things he usually rushed past. The way the streetlights created pools of golden light, the sound of evening birds settling into the trees, the distant laughter of children playing in a nearby park. Everything felt connected to the magic of the previous night, as if the cub's visit had awakened something not just in the shop but in the entire neighborhood, the entire world. He thought about his grandfather, wondered if he'd felt the same sense of expansion after his own encounters with the impossible. He wished he could ask him, could share this experience with the man who'd somehow known to prepare them for it. But maybe that was part of the magic too. The way it connected generations across time, each one adding their own chapter to an ongoing story of wonder. When he got home, Lily had dinner waiting, and they ate quietly while Leo played with his toys, occasionally holding up the golden leaf to show them, as if making sure they remembered. After Leo was in bed, they sat on their porch, watching the stars come out one by one, and Lily said something that perfectly captured what Ethan had been feeling all day. It's not about the bear cub, is it? It's about remembering that impossible things can happen, that the world is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than we usually let ourselves believe. Ethan nodded, taking her hand, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. The cub had been the messenger, but the message was about something much larger, about keeping faith with mystery in a world that often seemed determined to explain everything away. They talked late into the night, sharing their different perspectives on what had happened, what it meant, what they would do with this knowledge going forward. They agreed to document it somehow, maybe in a journal that could be passed down like the shop itself, another family heirloom that carried more than just words on pages. They wanted Leo to remember, even if the memory faded into something dreamlike as he grew older. Wanted him to know that his parents had shown him real magic when he was young enough to accept it without question. They talked about the little girl who'd seemed to know about the bear, wondered if there were others like her, people who could sense the magic that lived in certain places, certain moments. As midnight approached again, they found themselves looking toward the shop, though it wasn't visible from their house, wondering if perhaps another visitor had come, if another family was experiencing their own encounter with the impossible. They decided it didn't matter whether it happened again. What mattered was that it had happened once, that they had been present for it, had been trusted with it. The night was warm and full of the sounds of summer, crickets and distant trains, and the whisper of wind through leaves, and everything felt alive with potential, with the promise that the world would never run out of mysteries to offer those who knew how to receive them. Before they went to bed, Ethan checked on Leo one more time, found him sleeping peacefully with the leaf on his pillow beside him. In the soft glow of the nightlight, the leaf seemed to pulse gently, or maybe that was just Ethan's imagination, his mind still trying to make sense of something that didn't need to make sense. He adjusted Leo's blanket, whispered that he loved him, and thought about all the wonders this child might encounter in his life if they could keep his heart open to them. He thought about the world Leo would inherit, hoped it would still have room for mystery and magic, for bear cubs in candy stores and leaves that appeared from nowhere. He made a silent promise to do his part in preserving that possibility, in keeping the door open for gentle magic wherever and whenever it might appear. The days that followed were ordinary in all the ways days usually are, filled with work and meals and bedtime stories, but they were also different, touched by the awareness that extraordinary things could happen at any moment. Ethan found himself being more patient with difficult customers, more generous with children who couldn't quite afford the candy they wanted, as if the cub's visit had reminded him that kindness was its own kind of magic. Lily reported similar feelings, said she found herself looking at the world with what she called soft eyes, ready to see beauty and wonder in unexpected places. Even Leo seemed affected, calmer and more observant, as if he was watching for his friend to return. A week passed, then 2, and life settled back into its familiar rhythms, though the leaf remained on display in a small frame behind the counter, positioned so that only those working the register would notice it. Sometimes Ethan caught customers glancing at it with curious expressions, but no one asked about it directly. Maybe they sensed it was private, or maybe the leaf had its own magic that kept it from being too closely examined by those who weren't meant to know its story. Either way, it became part of the shop's atmosphere, another layer of history in a place already rich with memories and meaning. One afternoon, while organizing some old papers in the shop's back office, Ethan found a journal he'd never seen before, hidden behind a stack of inventory ledgers from the 1960s. The leather cover was worn smooth with age, and when he opened it, he recognized his grandfather's handwriting immediately. The first entry was dated 50 years ago, and it began, "Tonight, something wonderful happened." A small fox appeared in the display case, silver as moonlight and calm as still water. Ethan's hand shook as he read on, discovering that his grandfather had documented several such visits over the years, each one different but all sharing that same quality of gentle magic, of creatures appearing when they were most needed, bringing messages of hope and wonder to a world that sometimes forgot such things existed. The journal became their most treasured possession, proof that they were part of something that stretched back through time and would likely continue long after they were gone. They read it together in the evenings, learning about the peacock that had appeared during a particularly harsh winter, its feathers bringing color and warmth to the coldest season. They read about the rabbit that had come during the town's economic crisis, somehow inspiring a sense of resilience and hope that helped the community survive. Each story was told simply, without embellishment, but the love and wonder in his grandfather's words made them glow with significance. At the end of the journal, in an entry dated just days before his death, his grandfather had written, "I leave this record for whoever comes next, whoever is chosen to be the guardian of this gentle mystery. Trust in the magic. Keep the door open. Remember that wonder never truly leaves us. It only waits for the right moment to return." They decided to continue the journal, adding their own entry about the bear cub, trying to capture not just what had happened, but how it had felt, how it had changed them. Ethan wrote about Leo's innocent joy, about the way the cub had seemed to bring peace rather than fear, about the leaf that remained as proof that some things couldn't be explained but only experienced. Lily added her own thoughts about the connection between past and present, about how the shop served as a kind of anchor point for magic in an increasingly skeptical world. They left space for Leo to add his own memories when he was older, if he remembered, if he wanted to be part of this ongoing story. The shop continued to thrive in its quiet way, serving its community with sweetness in more ways than one. Sometimes Ethan caught himself watching the display case extra carefully, especially on quiet evenings when the light fell just right and the world seemed to hold its breath. He never saw another creature appear, but he sometimes felt something, a presence or a potential, as if the case was always ready, always waiting for the next moment when magic would need a place to rest. He kept it meticulously clean, the brass polished to a high shine, the velvet lining brushed smooth, maintaining it like a shrine to possibility. Customers came and went. Children grew up and brought their own children. The seasons changed and changed again, but the shop remained constant, a fixed point in a turning world. The story of the bear cub became part of Ethan and Lily's private mythology, something they referenced in subtle ways, a shared secret that strengthened their bond and reminded them of what was possible. Leo grew from a baby to a toddler to a young boy, and while his specific memories of that night faded, he retained a special affection for bears and a tendency to look for magic in unexpected places. He would often stand in front of the display case, not asking for candy but just watching, as if waiting for something he couldn't quite remember but knew was important. Years passed this way, ordinary years filled with extraordinary awareness, and the shop remained what it had always been, a place where sweetness was dispensed, where children's faces lit up with delight, where magic could rest when it needed to. The leaf in its frame aged gracefully, never crumbling or fading, maintaining its golden glow like a beacon of possibility. New families moved to the neighborhood, drawn by something they couldn't quite name, a feeling that this was a place where good things happened, where the ordinary and extraordinary coexisted peacefully. The shop became known as a lucky place, though no one could say exactly why, just that things seemed to work out for people who spent time there, as if the residual magic of all those nighttime visitors had seeped into the walls and floors, blessing all who entered. One evening, many years after the bear cub's visit, when Leo was old enough to help close the shop and Ethan's hair had gone gray at the temples, they found themselves alone in the store after hours, wiping down counters in the familiar ritual that connected them to generations past. Leo, now tall and thoughtful, paused in front of the display case and said, "Dad, I've been having dreams about a bear, a small bear in this case. Is that weird?" Ethan's breath caught, and he looked at his son, seeing in his eyes the same openness to wonder that had allowed them all to witness magic years before. He made a decision then, pulled out the journal, and showed Leo the truth about the shop, about his grandfather, about the night when he was just a baby and magic had visited them all. Leo read in silence, his eyes widening with each entry, and when he finished, he looked at the display case with new understanding. "So it really happened," he said, not a question but a statement of wonder. "The leaf, the dreams I sometimes have, that feeling I get in the shop sometimes like something's about to happen, it's all real." Ethan nodded, watching his son process this inheritance, this responsibility that came with knowing the truth about the world's hidden magic. Leo touched the glass of the case gently, reverently, and said, "I'll keep the door open too, for whatever needs to come through." And Ethan knew then that the shop would continue to be what it had always been, a sanctuary for gentle magic in a world that needed reminders of wonder. That night, as they locked up and walked to their cars, Leo asked, "Do you think it will happen again? Do you think we'll see another visitor?" Ethan thought about it, looking back at the shop that had been his life's work and his life's privilege to maintain. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think that's not really the point. The point is being ready if it does, keeping our hearts open to the possibility. The magic isn't just in the creatures that visit, it's in the waiting, in the watching, in the believing that such things are possible. Leo nodded, understanding in a way that made Ethan proud, and they drove home through streets that seemed touched with starlight, carrying the secret of the shop with them like a flame that would never go out. The story could end here, with this passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, but magic doesn't really end, it just transforms, continues in new ways. Somewhere, perhaps, someone reading this story late at night, unable to sleep, might start to wonder about their own familiar spaces, might begin to look for the places where magic could rest if given the chance. They might remember being young and believing in impossible things, might realize that growing up doesn't have to mean growing out of wonder. They might think about Ethan and Lily and Leo and the bear cub, about the shop that serves as a doorway between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and they might decide to keep their own doors open just in case. Because that's what stories like this do. They remind us that the world is vast and mysterious and full of possibilities we haven't even imagined yet. They tell us that magic isn't just for fairy tales, but can appear in candy shops and living rooms, and anywhere else where people are brave enough to believe in it. They whisper that we're all connected by our capacity for wonder, that whether we're watching from bustling cities or quiet towns, from places where bears are common or places where they're only in picture books, we all share the same deep need to believe that there's more to life than what we can measure and explain. The bear cub in the candy store isn't just about a bear cub in a candy store. It's about keeping faith with mystery, about choosing to see the world as a place where impossible things can still happen. That in 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. As dawn broke over the town the next morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to echo the color of the magical leaf, Lily stood in their kitchen making breakfast while Ethan and Leo sat at the table, the journal open between them. They had stayed up late into the night, reading and rereading the entries, Leo asking questions about his great-grandfather he'd never met, about the other creatures that had visited, about what it all meant. The morning light streaming through the window seemed different now to Leo, charged with possibility, and he kept glancing at it as if expecting to see something magical floating in the dust motes that danced in the golden beams. Lily brought over plates of pancakes, shaped like bears at Leo's request, and they ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they now knew to be true about the world. "Mom," Leo said suddenly, syrup dripping from his fork, "you knew all along, didn't you? About the magic, about what the shop really was?" Lily smiled, that mysterious smile that had always made Ethan fall in love with her over and over again, and nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to work in the shop when she was young," she said, surprising both Ethan and Leo with this revelation. "She told me stories, but like your father, I thought they were just stories until that night with the cub. She used to say that some families are chosen to be keepers of wonder, to maintain places where the 2 worlds can touch. She said I would know if I married into such a family, that there would be signs." She looked at Ethan with such tenderness that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "The first time you brought me to the shop, I felt it, that hum of possibility, that sense of something waiting. I knew then that the stories were true, that I was meant to be part of this." This new information shifted everything slightly, like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal a new pattern made from the same pieces. Ethan realized that their meeting hadn't been random, that perhaps the magic of the shop had drawn them together, knowing they would need each other to witness and protect what would come. He thought about all the small moments that had led them here, choosing to take over the shop when his father retired, Lily encouraging him even when business was slow, Leo being born just in time to witness the cub's visit while still young enough to accept it without question. It all felt orchestrated by something larger than chance, a gentle guidance toward this moment of understanding and continuation. Leo was processing this new information with the intense focus of a teenager discovering that the world was both more complex and more wonderful than he'd imagined. "So, there are others?" he asked. "Other places like our shop, other families like ours?" Lily and Ethan exchanged glances, realizing they didn't know the answer to that question. The journal mentioned no other locations, no network of magic keepers, but it seemed impossible that they were alone in this. "I think," Lily said carefully, "that there must be. Magic this gentle, this careful, it wouldn't put all its eggs in one basket. There are probably places all over the world where wonder can rest when it needs to. People all over who keep watch without even knowing that others are doing the same." This thought seemed to comfort Leo, the idea that they were part of something larger, even if they couldn't see its full shape. He closed the journal carefully, running his fingers over the worn leather cover, and said, "I want to add my own entry, about what I remember, about the dreams I've had. Is that okay?" His parents nodded encouragingly, and Leo went to get a pen, returning with the careful solemnity of someone about to perform a sacred task. His handwriting was neat and precise as he began. "I don't remember the night itself, but I remember the feeling. Safe. Warm. Like the whole universe was holding its breath in wonder. And I remember the dreams that came after, dreams of a small bear that spoke without words, that told me stories about the connections between all living things." As Leo wrote, Ethan found himself thinking about all the people who had shopped at their store over the years, wondering how many of them had sensed something special without knowing what it was. He thought about the children who pressed their faces against the display case with unusual intensity, about the adults who lingered longer than necessary, drawn by something they couldn't name. Maybe they all felt it on some level, that thin place where magic touched the ordinary world, even if they didn't consciously recognize it. Maybe that was part of the shop's purpose too, to give people just a brush with wonder, just enough to keep their hearts open to possibility. The day unfolded with its usual Saturday rhythm, errands and chores, and preparation for the coming week, but everything felt different now that Leo was part of the secret. He moved through his tasks with a new awareness, as if seeing the world through magic-tinted glasses. When they went to the shop that afternoon to check on things and prepare for the Sunday rush of families seeking weekend treats, Leo stood in front of the display case for a long time, not speaking, just being present with it in a way that reminded Ethan powerfully of that night years ago when his baby son had connected so instantly with the bear cub. "I can feel it," Leo said quietly. "Not like something about to happen, but like potential. Like the case is a door that's closed but not locked, and something could open it if it needed to." Ethan knew exactly what he meant, had felt that same sensation countless times over the years. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the space beyond, the vastness that existed just past the solid ground. The case was solid, real, filled with ordinary candy, but it was also somehow more than that. A threshold between worlds that mostly stayed separate, but sometimes, on special nights, could overlap. A customer came in then, a young mother with twin daughters who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The girls ran immediately to the display case, their small hands leaving prints on the glass as they exclaimed over the colorful array of sweets. But one of them, the one with darker hair and serious eyes, stopped mid-exclamation and tilted her head, as if listening to something only she could hear. She looked up at Leo, who was standing nearby, and said in a matter-of-fact voice, "The bear likes you. He says you're a good guardian." Before anyone could respond, she had turned back to choosing candy with her sister. leaving Leo standing there with his mouth open in shock. The mother apologized, embarrassed, saying something about imaginative children and too many fairy tales. But Ethan saw the look in her eyes, a flicker of something that suggested she knew her daughter saw things others didn't, even if she didn't quite believe it herself. After they left with their purchases, Leo turned to his father with wide eyes. Did that really just happen? Did she really know about the bear? Ethan nodded slowly, remembering the little girl years ago who had made a similar comment. I think some people are just more sensitive to these things, he said. Children, especially, before the world teaches them what's impossible. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the shop, Leo helping with inventory while Ethan caught up on paperwork, but both of them were really just being present with the space, feeling its layers of history and magic. As the sun began to set, painting the shop in golden light that made everything look touched by enchantment, Leo asked, "What do you think the bear cub was? I mean, really? Just a bear or something more?" It was a question Ethan had pondered countless times, and he still didn't have a definitive answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that it doesn't matter what it was in any scientific sense. What matters is what it represented, what it brought to us. Wonder, connection. A reminder that the world is deeper and stranger than we usually acknowledge." Leo seemed satisfied with this answer, or at least willing to sit with its ambiguity. They locked up as darkness fell, the familiar routine now charged with new meaning for Leo, who understood that he wasn't just locking a shop, but securing a sanctuary. As they walked to the car, he said, "I want to learn everything about the shop, about its history, about Great-Grandpa and how he discovered its magic. I want to be ready, in case something else comes through, in case I'm the one here when it happens." The determination in his voice made Ethan proud and a little sad, knowing that his son was accepting a responsibility that would shape his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. That night, they had a family meeting of sorts, the three of them sitting around the dining room table with the journal between them like a sacred text. They talked about what it meant to be guardians of this secret, about the responsibility and the privilege of it. They made plans to research the shop's history more thoroughly, to see if they could find any other mentions of strange occurrences, any other families who might have been touched by similar magic. They discussed whether to tell certain trusted friends or family members, ultimately deciding that the secret should remain closely held, shared only with those who had already shown signs of understanding. "We need to document everything," Lily said, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of mystery. "Not just the big events, but the small things, too. The children who seem to know more than they should, the times when the case feels different, the dreams we have. It all might be important, might be pieces of a bigger picture we can't see yet." They agreed to keep a more detailed journal, to photograph the shop regularly in case subtle changes occurred that they might not notice day to day, to pay attention to patterns and connections that might reveal themselves over time. As the evening deepened into night, they found themselves sharing memories that took on new significance in light of what they now knew. Ethan remembered a time when he was young and had seen what he thought was a butterfly in the case, but when he'd blinked, it was gone, and his father had told him it was just a reflection. Lily recalled bringing flowers to the shop once, and having them bloom impossibly fast and full while sitting near the case, though she'd attributed it to the warm temperature inside. Leo talked about dreams he'd had throughout his childhood, dreams of animals that spoke without words, of a shop that was bigger on the inside than the outside, of his great-grandfather standing behind the counter, smiling and nodding as if to say everything was as it should be. They stayed up late again, not wanting the conversation to end, not wanting to return to a world where such discussions weren't possible. But eventually, exhaustion won, and they prepared for bed, each carrying with them a sense of having crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The world would never look quite the same, now that they had fully accepted their role as keepers of wonder. As Ethan lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night, he thought about all the guardians who might have come before his grandfather, stretching back through history, each one maintaining their own small sanctuary for magic in a world that increasingly forgot to believe in it. He wondered what would happen to the shop in the future, whether Leo would have children who would inherit this responsibility, whether the magic would continue to flow through generations or would one day simply stop, its purpose fulfilled. But then he remembered his grandfather's words in the journal. Wonder never truly leaves us. It only waits for the right moment to return. This comforted him, the idea that even if the shop someday became just an ordinary candy store again, the magic wouldn't be lost, just relocated, waiting to emerge somewhere else when the world needed it most. Sleep came slowly, bringing dreams of the shop transformed into something vast and luminous, filled with creatures of light and shadow. All of them peaceful, all of them bearing messages for a world that had forgotten how to listen. In his dream, Ethan saw Leo as an adult, standing behind the counter with his own child, pointing to the display case and telling the story of the bear cub, keeping the tradition alive. He saw Lily, older but still radiant, arranging flowers near the case and smiling as they bloomed with impossible beauty. He saw himself, gray and weathered but content, knowing that he had been a faithful guardian of something precious and rare. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the demands of ordinary life, but the dream lingered, coloring everything with a sense of purpose and continuity. They went about their Sunday routines, breakfast, newspaper, preparation for the week ahead, but with a new awareness of the magic that hummed beneath the surface of their everyday existence. Leo spent the morning reading and rereading the journal, making notes in the margins, cross-referencing dates with historical events, looking for patterns that might explain when and why the creatures appeared. His dedication reminded Ethan of himself at that age, hungry for understanding, eager to find meaning in the mysteries of life. That afternoon, they opened the shop for its Sunday hours, and it filled quickly with families enjoying their weekend outings. Children ran between the aisles, their laughter bright and infectious, while parents chatted and selected treats for the week ahead. It was a scene that had played out countless times over the decades, ordinary and sweet in its simplicity. But now Ethan saw it differently, saw how the shop served as more than just a place of commerce. It was a gathering place, a constant in people's lives, a source of small joys that accumulated into something larger. Maybe that was part of its magic too, the way it brought people together, created connections, fostered community. Late in the afternoon, an elderly man came in, someone Ethan had never seen before. He moved slowly but purposefully to the display case and stood there for a long moment, his weathered hands pressed against the glass. Then he looked up at Ethan with eyes that held depths of knowledge and said, "Your grandfather was a good man. He understood what this place was, what it meant. I'm glad to see you're continuing his work." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, how he had known his grandfather, the man purchased a single piece of butterscotch candy and left, disappearing into the crowd outside before Ethan could follow. Leo, who had witnessed the exchange, looked at his father with excitement. He knew. That man knew about the magic. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with questions. How many others were out there who understood? How many had witnessed their own impossible moments in this shop or places like it? He made a note in the journal about the encounter. describing the man as best he could remember, hoping that someday the connection might become clear. These breadcrumbs of mystery, these hints that they were part of something larger, they were almost as magical as the bear cub itself. As closing time approached and the last customers filed out, the family found themselves alone in the shop once again. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes into tiny golden stars, and for a moment, the whole space seemed to shimmer with potential. Leo stood at the display case, his hand resting on the glass, and said quietly, "Thank you for keeping this place safe, for being ready when we need you." It was a prayer of sorts, or maybe a promise, and Ethan felt the rightness of it, the way it connected them to all the guardians who had stood in this same spot and felt this same gratitude. They closed up slowly, each of them reluctant to leave the space that had become even more sacred now that its secret was fully shared among them. As they stood outside, looking back at the shop in the gathering dusk, Lily said, "You know, I think the bear cub wasn't just a random visitor. I think it came specifically for us, at exactly the right time, to ensure that the tradition would continue, that Leo would understand his inheritance while he was still young enough to fully accept it." The idea resonated with truth, the way the best insights do, and they all stood quietly, contemplating the perfection of the timing, the way everything had aligned to create that one magical night. The drive home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of people who had shared something profound and were still processing its implications. Leo sat in the back seat, the journal in his lap, occasionally reading passages aloud that struck him as particularly meaningful. One entry from his great-grandfather stood out. "The magic doesn't come to those who seek it aggressively or try to force it. It comes to those who simply maintain a space of openness, who tend their small corner of the world with love and patience, trusting that if they're needed, they'll be called upon." This philosophy of patient readiness, of active waiting, seemed to capture something essential about their role as guardians. They weren't meant to go hunting for magic or trying to make it happen. They were meant to simply be ready, to keep the door open, to maintain the shop as a place where wonder could feel welcome if it needed to manifest. It was a humble role in some ways, but also a profound one, requiring a kind of faith that ran counter to the modern world's demand for proof and control. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Leo asked a question that had clearly been bothering him. "What if I'm not here when the next visitor comes? What if I'm away at college or living somewhere else? What if I miss it?" The fear in his voice was real, the worry that he might fail in his inherited duty. Lily put her arm around him and said, "The magic knows what it's doing. If you're meant to witness something, you'll be there. And if you're not, then someone else will be. Someone who needs to see it more than you do. Trust the process. Trust the magic to know what it needs." This seemed to comfort Leo, the idea that the magic itself was intelligent, purposeful, not random or chaotic, but operating according to some deeper logic they couldn't fully understand. They ate dinner talking about other things. School, plans for the summer, normal family topics. But underneath it all was this new current of understanding, this shared secret that had transformed them from a regular family into something more, guardians of a mystery that connected them to the past and future in ways they were only beginning to understand. After dinner, Leo went to his room to do homework, but Ethan knew he was probably reading the journal again, memorizing every entry, looking for clues about what might come next. Lily and Ethan sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder, both of them marveling at how their lives had been changed by a single night's visitation. "Do you ever wonder," Lily asked, What would have happened if we hadn't been open to it? If we'd called animal control or run away or refused to believe what we were seeing? Ethan had wondered the same thing many times. I think, he said, that the magic knew we wouldn't. That's why it chose us, chose that moment. It knew we were ready, even if we didn't know it ourselves. The idea that they had been chosen, selected by forces beyond their understanding to play this role, was both humbling and empowering. It meant their lives had purpose beyond what they could see, that their simple candy shop was part of some grand design they might never fully comprehend. As the night deepened and they prepared for bed, Ethan found himself feeling grateful not just for the magic itself, but for the way it had brought his family together, had given them this shared purpose that transcended the ordinary concerns of daily life. He checked on Leo before going to bed, found him asleep with the journal open on his chest, a slight smile on his face as if his dreams were good ones. Ethan carefully bookmarked the page and set the journal on the nightstand, then stood for a moment watching his son sleep, thinking about the journey ahead of him. Leo would face choices Ethan couldn't imagine, would have to balance this magical responsibility with the demands of modern life, would have to find ways to keep the wonder alive in a world that might try to convince him it was all just imagination. But looking at the peace on his son's face, Ethan felt confident that Leo was up to the task, that the magic had chosen well. As he lay in his own bed, listening to Lily's quiet breathing beside him, Ethan thought about everyone who might be reading or hearing this story, all the souls scattered across the world who were sharing in this mystery. He hoped they could feel what he felt, that sense of being part of something larger, that recognition that wonder wasn't extinct, but simply waiting for the right moments to reveal itself. He hoped they would look at their own lives with new eyes, would search for the places where magic might be hiding in plain sight, would keep their hearts open to the possibility of impossible things. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing on the distant highway, the settling of the house around them. But underneath these ordinary noises, Ethan thought he could hear something else, a kind of pulse or rhythm that might have been his imagination or might have been the heartbeat of the magic itself, steady and patient and eternal. He fell asleep to this rhythm, dreaming of the shop filled with light, of creatures made of starlight and shadow, of his grandfather standing behind the counter, nodding approvingly at how his legacy was being maintained. The next morning brought rain, a gentle shower that washed the world clean and made everything sparkle when the sun broke through the clouds. Leo left for school carrying the journal in his backpack, not to share with anyone but just to have it close, like a talisman connecting him to the larger mystery. Lily went to her job at the library, where she had already started researching the history of the building that housed the shop, looking for any mentions of unusual occurrences or previous owners who might have known about the magic. And Ethan opened the shop as he did every morning, but with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he wasn't just selling candy but maintaining a sanctuary for wonder. The day passed quietly, with the usual stream of customers and the familiar rhythms of commerce. But Ethan noticed things he might have missed before, the way certain people lingered near the display case, the way children sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at it with unfocused eyes, as if seeing something beyond the physical, the way the afternoon light seemed to pool around it like water. He made mental notes of all these observations, planning to add them to the journal that evening, building their record of the subtle ways magic moved through the world. Around 3 o'clock, just as the after-school rush was beginning, something interesting happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, came in with her grandmother. While the grandmother browsed the chocolate selection, the girl went straight to the display case and placed both hands on it, closing her eyes as if listening to something. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly at Ethan and said, It's almost time for another visit. Can you feel it? The air is getting thin, like before a storm, but a good storm, a magical one. Her grandmother, embarrassed, quickly ushered her out after making their purchase, but not before the girl turned back and gave Ethan a knowing smile. He stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. Could the girl be right? Was another visitation imminent? He tried to feel what she had described, that thinning of the air, but everything seemed normal to him. Still, he made a detailed note in the journal he kept behind the counter, recording the girl's exact words and the time and date. If she was right, if something was coming, he wanted to be ready. He texted Lily and Leo about the encounter, and both responded with excitement and curiosity. Leo said he would come straight to the shop after school, and Lily promised to leave work early so they could all be together just in case. The rest of the afternoon passed in a state of heightened awareness, every sound and shadow potentially significant. Customers came and went, oblivious to the tension Ethan felt, the sense of standing on the edge of something momentous. When Leo arrived, still in his school uniform with his backpack heavy with books, he immediately went to the display case and stood there, trying to feel what the girl had felt. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't feel anything different," he said, disappointed. Maybe she was wrong, or maybe it's not time yet. Lily arrived soon after, and the three of them tried to go about the normal closing routine, but there was an electric quality to the air, a sense of anticipation that made ordinary tasks feel charged with meaning. As the sun set and the shop grew quiet, they found themselves gathering near the display case, waiting without really knowing what they were waiting for. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last, until finally Ethan said, maybe the girl was mistaken. Maybe she was just imaginative, seeing things that weren't there. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. There had been something in her eyes, a certainty that reminded him of the other children who had seemed to know about the magic. They decided to stay a while longer, to give whatever might happen a chance to unfold. They turned off most of the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the display case illumination, and settled in to wait. Leo pulled out the journal and began reading aloud from his great-grandfather's entries, his voice soft and rhythmic in the semi-darkness. The stories of past visitations filled the space, making it feel as if all those magical moments were somehow present, layered on top of each other like transparent photographs. An hour passed, then 2, and nothing happened. The shop remained quiet, ordinary, just a candy store after closing time. Finally, Lily suggested they go home, that perhaps the girl had been sensing something further in the future, not immediate. They gathered their things reluctantly, all of them feeling a bit disappointed, even though they knew magic couldn't be summoned on demand. As Ethan reached for the light switch, something made him pause and look back at the display case one more time. For just a second, he thought he saw something. A shimmer in the air, a suggestion of movement, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" he asked, but Lily and Leo shook their heads. Maybe it had been his imagination, his desire to see magic manifesting as a trick of tired eyes. They locked up and went home, but the feeling persisted that something was building, that the girl had been right about the approach of another visitation, even if the timing wasn't clear. That night, they all had vivid dreams. Ethan dreamed of butterflies made of light. Lily dreamed of flowers that sang, and Leo dreamed of the bear cub again. But this time, it spoke to him in a voice like wind chimes, telling him to be patient, that everything happened in its own perfect time. The next few days passed in a state of watchful waiting. They took turns spending extra time in the shop, especially during the quiet hours when magic seemed most likely to manifest. Regular customers began to notice their increased attention to the display case, some joking that they must be expecting a very special delivery. If only they knew how right they were, Ethan thought, but he just smiled and made small talk, maintaining the normal facade while underneath his whole being was attuned to the possibility of wonder. On the 5th day after the girl's prediction, something finally happened, though not what any of them had expected. It was early morning, before the shop was open, and Ethan had come in early to do inventory. The sun was just rising, painting the shop in soft golden light, when he heard it. A sound like singing, but not quite. More like the memory of singing, or the echo of a song that had been sung long ago. It seemed to be coming from the display case, and as he approached, he saw that the glass was fogged over from the inside, as if something warm was breathing against it. He called Lily and Leo immediately, telling them to come quickly but quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. As he waited for them, he watched the fog on the glass form patterns, spirals and stars and shapes that looked almost like letters in a language he didn't recognize. The singing continued, wordless and beautiful, filling the shop with a sense of peace so profound that Ethan found tears streaming down his face without knowing why. This was different from the bear cub, more ethereal, less physical, but equally magical. When Lily and Leo arrived, breathless from hurrying, they all stood together watching as the fog slowly cleared, and there, in the center of the display case, was a single flower. But what a flower it was! It seemed to be made of light itself, its petals shifting through every color imaginable, its stem a thread of silver that didn't quite touch the velvet lining but floated just above it. The singing was coming from the flower, or through it, as if it was a conduit for some celestial music that existed beyond normal hearing. They stood transfixed, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Leo was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "It's more beautiful than the bear cub. Different, but just as magical." He was right. Where the cub had brought a sense of earthly wonder, this flower brought something otherworldly. A reminder that magic took many forms, not all of them as straightforward as animals in unexpected places. They watched as the flower slowly rotated, its light casting rainbow patterns on the walls of the shop, transforming the ordinary space into something that looked like the inside of a prism. "Should we open the case?" Lily asked, but even as she said it, they all knew the answer. This wasn't like the bear cub, which had needed to leave. This flower was meant to be contained, observed, perhaps absorbed in some way they didn't yet understand. They pulled up chairs and sat in a semicircle around the case, watching as the flower continued its slow dance, its colors deepening and brightening in waves that seemed timed to some cosmic rhythm they could almost but not quite perceive. Time seemed to slow down or speed up. It was hard to tell which. The morning sun climbed higher, but none of them thought about opening the shop, about the normal business of the day. This was more important than commerce, more important than maintaining schedules. This was the reason the shop existed, to be a vessel for these moments of pure magic that reminded them of what lay beyond the visible world. The flower's song grew stronger, more complex, harmonies layering upon harmonies until it seemed like a full choir was singing from within that single impossible bloom. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the flower began to fade. Not dramatically, but gently, like morning mist evaporating in sunlight. Its colors grew softer, its form less distinct, until finally it was just a suggestion of light, and then nothing at all. The singing stopped, leaving a silence that felt full rather than empty, as if the air itself had been enriched by what they'd witnessed. They sat for a moment longer, none of them wanting to be the first to break the spell with words or movement. Finally, Leo stood and approached the case, There, where the flower had been, was another leaf, but this one was silver, metallic but organic, with veins that seemed to pulse with residual light. He picked it up carefully, and as he did, they all heard it, a single note of the flower's song, clear and pure, before it too faded into silence. "Another gift," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Another reminder that we're not imagining this, that it's all real." They added the silver leaf to their collection, placing it in a frame next to the golden one from the bear cub. Side by side, they looked like artifacts from another world, which, in a way, they were. Ethan made a detailed entry in the journal, trying to capture not just what they'd seen, but how it had felt. The way the flower's presence had seemed to temporarily transform them all into something more than human, or perhaps had reminded them that being human included the capacity for experiencing such transcendent beauty. The shop remained closed that day, something that had never happened except for major holidays. They put a sign on the door saying, "Family emergency," which wasn't entirely untrue. This was a family matter, and it was, in its own way, an emergency of the soul, an urgent need to process what they'd witnessed. They spent the day together, talking about the experience, comparing their perceptions, trying to understand what it meant that the magic had taken this new form. Was it evolving? Were they being prepared for something? Or was this simply another facet of the same mystery, another way for wonder to manifest in their carefully tended space? As evening came, they finally opened the shop for a few hours, feeling it was important to maintain some normalcy, to ground themselves in the ordinary after touching the extraordinary. Customers came in, bought their usual items, chatted about everyday things, and the routine of it was actually comforting. It reminded them that they lived in both worlds, the magical and the mundane, and that both were necessary, each giving context and meaning to the other. Several people commented on how radiant the three of them looked, asking if they'd been on vacation or received good news. In a way, both were true. That night, as they prepared to close, the same young girl who had predicted the visitation came in with her grandmother again. She went straight to the display case, placed her hand on it, and smiled. "You saw it," she said to Ethan. "The singing flower. It was beautiful. Wasn't it?" Before he could respond, she added, "There will be more. Different kinds of magic for different times. The shop is waking up now, remembering what it was built for. You're good guardians. It trusts you." Then she selected a lollipop. Her grandmother paid for it with an apologetic smile, and they were gone. Ethan, Lily, and Leo stood in stunned silence for a moment before Leo said, "We need to find out who she is. She knows things, understands things. Maybe she's like us, from another guardian family." They resolved to pay attention the next time she came in, to try to engage her in conversation, to learn what she knew and how she knew it. But part of them suspected she would remain a mystery, another thread in the tapestry of magic they were only beginning to see the pattern of. As they locked up and headed home, the silver leaf safely tucked in Leo's backpack alongside the journal, they felt a sense of completion but also of beginning. The flower had been different from the cub, its message more abstract but no less powerful. Where the cub had brought them together as a family of guardians, the flower had reminded them that magic wasn't limited to forms they could easily understand. That wonder could manifest in ways that challenged their perceptions of what was possible. The world outside the shop seemed different now, touched by the residual glow of the flower's light. Street lamps looked like earthbound stars. Car headlights traced patterns that seemed almost meaningful, and the night sky itself appeared deeper, more layered with possibility. They drove home in contemplative silence, each processing the experience in their own way. but all of them changed by it, expanded by it, made more capable of seeing the magic that had always been there, waiting for eyes that knew how to look. That night, their dreams were filled with colors that didn't exist in the waking world, with music that couldn't be played on any earthly instrument, with the sense of being part of a vast, loving consciousness that expressed itself through small miracles in candy shops and the patient watching of those who remembered how to believe. They woke the next morning feeling refreshed despite the intensity of the previous day, ready to continue their guardianship with renewed purpose and deepened understanding. The shop, when they opened it that morning, seemed to hum with satisfaction, as if it too had been nourished by the flower's visit. The display case gleamed more brightly, the candy seemed more colorful, and even the air felt charged with a subtle energy that made everyone who entered smile without quite knowing why. This was what it meant to be guardians of wonder, not just to witness the big magical events, but to tend the space between them, to maintain the conditions that allowed magic to flourish when it chose to appear. As the days passed and life returned to its normal rhythms, they found themselves changed in subtle but profound ways. They were more patient with difficult customers, more attentive to children's seemingly fantastical observations, more aware of the thin places where the ordinary and extraordinary touched. The silver leaf, like its golden companion, never tarnished or deteriorated, remaining a perfect reminder that they had been chosen to witness something beyond the everyday world's comprehension. Leo began writing his own entries in the journal, not just about magical visitations, but about his thoughts on what it all meant, his theories about why the shop was special, his dreams and intuitions about what might come next. His writing was thoughtful and mature beyond his years, as if the responsibility of being a guardian had accelerated his growth in ways that had nothing to do with physical age. Ethan and Lily read his entries with pride and fascination, seeing their son become not just the heir to a magical legacy, but an active participant in its unfolding. One entry particularly stood out. "I think the shop isn't just a place where magic happens. I think it's a place where the boundary between worlds is thin, where what we call reality and what we call magic can meet and recognize each other as two faces of the same truth. The creatures and objects that appear aren't visiting from somewhere else. They're showing us that somewhere else and here are the same place, seen from different angles. We're not guardians of a location, but of a perspective, a way of seeing that keeps the wholeness of the world from being forgotten." This insight stunned Ethan and Lily with its sophistication, its suggestion that their role was even more important than they'd imagined. They weren't just keeping a space for occasional magical visitations. They were maintaining a kind of consciousness, a remembering that the world was more than material, more than what could be measured and catalogued. They were, in their small way, keeping alive humanity's capacity for wonder, its ability to perceive the miraculous in the midst of the mundane,